Juma Mubarak, peace and blessings be upon you, and may the mercy of Allah find you. For it is those who extend mercy who shall receive it. Today, for my Zen Hutbah, I thought I would talk briefly about Haram and Halal and the wisdom underlying these rules. There's often a distinction between Sufi mysticism and perhaps, for example, Buddhism, where one must be within the Sharia in order to finally proceed on to the next level of tariqah. But in reality, if you study Buddhism in any modest depth, you'll find that Buddhists have very similar rules and they have a similar concept of merit and karma as a point system. It's just that the judgment is more attenuated. Instead of being all in one kiyama, it happens over reincarnations. So it's a little bit more nuanced. There's more intermediate degrees. Whereas in the Quran, we have al-Araf, and then we have 7 levels of punishment. And there's an open window event, if you will, for annihilation and the duration of the punishment versus its perpetuity. So it's more dramatic. And also, how long would one have to wait in al-Araf as a bridge case? And then in the reincarnation-based systems, there's a Buddhist teacher who says that if you give a lot of charity, but you're very sinful otherwise, so you're like a celebrity do-gooder who has a decadent lifestyle, then you'll reincarnate as somebody's privileged pet, like the Paris Hilton dogs, for example. So you'll live a life of unrestrained animality, but in a very beneficent context, which is kind of funny. So there's certainly a concept of Sharia and Haram and Halal in these other mystical traditions. But anyway, within Islam, there's an understanding that things are haram for no other reason simply than because God said so. And everything is purely a compliance test. Look at that little guy. And there's a tafsir of Maida 46 and 48, where, not Ibn Kathir, it's another one, I think more recent, where the Mufassirin exegetes that this idea of a different law being appointed for different peoples is not pluralistic because they are in this kufr, this covering of the truth, that these verses don't mean what they seem to say they mean. So instead of we have created a law for each people, meaning that there are different covenants that are all valid in their own way, and some have different laws, and that there are different approaches. Hey, come here. What the tafsir says is that, for example, it's haram to pray at sunrise. This is based on a hadith that you shouldn't pray as the sun rises because the light of the sun as it crosses the horizon is like the horns of the devil, which when I read that, it certainly gave me pause. So people deconstructing that hadith might suggest that it is a fabrication that was trying to draw contrast with Zoroastrians who essentially are prostrating towards the sun, and indeed prostrating towards the sun or the moon, as done in the traditional Zoroastrianism prior to its monotheistic reformation as a reaction to Islam, is haram in the Quran, because you're mistaking the celestial bodies for God in the same way that Ibrahim alayhi salam is said to have done early in his monotheistic contemplations. So there is some basis for that. There's no indication in the Quran that there are that Iblis, Ar-Rajim, has horns. So it's a bit of it's a bit of a head scratching hadith, and they use this to fall into this idea that the things that we're commanded to do, like salah, are not good unto themselves, but rather that they're meant to be purely for compliance. And that if you're then told not to do it in a certain time, this is just more compliance. And therefore, that the changing of the Sharia between the Torah covenant and the Christian covenant, which presumably would be a more relaxed Noahide set of rules, which is more minimal, plus adding in more lax Sabbath observance and some of the wisdom teachings of the Injil. But then suddenly we go back to the Quran, where it's not quite as rigorous as the Torah. For instance, today is ostensibly the Quranic Sabbath, the Jummah, and I can work today. I can bake bread, I can do all sorts of things, but I am putting in extra time to pray and traveling to the Musalla to pray as well. So I'm observing the Sabbath, but I don't have as many restrictions. And likewise, I have dietary restrictions, but not as many, and so on. So I think that if we simply accept for 546, 548, and 569 without tahwil, and therefore we reject the ijma of the Sunni ulema. And this is not the ijma of all of the other sects, maybe the Ibadis, but I find that Shia tend to, not to be on a one note of praising Shia, but they tend to be more open to, for instance, the Zoroastrians, as the Quran says, being eligible for salvation in their monotheistic form, and also perhaps Buddhists who are monotheistic, and so on. This tends to also be true of Sufis, and this is true of many lay Sunnis who simply read the Quran and go, okay, they accept what it says. It's only the more specialized Sunni ulema who want to reify warped readings that existed to edify imperial stratifications, who try to do mental somersaults in order to say that these verses in context don't really mean what they say. So, taking that into account, we might think that God is good and that God intends good things for us, and that all of these prescriptions, the same way that a doctor is not malpracticing when he writes you a certain dosage of a certain medicine, it's a prescription. It's not so that you are submitting to the doctor, even though he does have expertise and you are submitting to his authority in the sense that you think he's right to give you that prescription. But the prescription itself has a teleological function to benefit you. So we talked about Salah and how Salah is not just jumping jacks done to make a monkey out of you for the divine, but rather it is a highly condensed combination of simplistic yoga and meditation and prayer and emotional appeal, dua, forgiveness asking. All of these things come into a package that is time condensed and can fit into a busy schedule, and even if you combine prayers in a very busy schedule. Um, Likewise, the dietary restrictions. So this is a debate about pork. Certainly in the medieval period and in antiquity, pork was dangerous for the risk of larval brain infection. As people say about Twitter ideologues, that you can literally get brain worms from eating pork. Nowadays, you don't. But raising pork industrially leads to abominations like pink lagoons that are not survivable for one to fall into. and there's a higher risk of viral mutations occurring in these pork farms and so on. And pigs are a more humanoid animal, and also that they're humanoid in the sense that their brains are very developed and they're intelligent. And there's an from going from the Noahide laws, there's an ethos of no of anti-animal cruelty in God's laws, and this runs through the Torah. And this may be something we can apply to the pork prohibition as well. Also, halal animal killing is meant to be done in a pacific way that reduces the cortisol levels of the animal and allows them a dignified end that is relatively quick and painless. And as well, that there's an exsanguination, which may also have some health benefits. The prohibition of eating blood is something from the Torah that runs through the Quran. The Noahide law against strangling an animal to death has to do with this principle of humane killing. And it is pretty much physically impossible to do that with a pig due to the pig's tremendous girth and heft. Um, Now, cow, of course, is even more physically weighty, but perhaps a cow has a cleaner jugular arrangement. But anyway, this is not the most pleasant topic. So then people have a lot of difficulties with the sexual rules in the Abrahamic covenants. And this is a big difference between an Aristotelian or Platonic God that is distant and fundamental from philosophical logics. But it doesn't therefore follow that this monad would care what people do in their intimate lives. But the Abrahamic covenants prescribe against certain behaviors, and they strongly prohibit heterosexuality outside of marriage. There's a reason for that. And the reason has multiple levels. One is emotional, one is economic, one has to do following the economic and the emotional with the continuity of the tradition through good parentage and creating a good example. And then there's a spiritual reason, which is that marriage is a fana. It is a yoga, if you will. It is an exercise in which you loosen the nafs by having to confront the reality of another person and their emotional needs and desires, as well as the physical. That's more in the economic level. But then having established that baseline that everybody has a shelter and enough food to eat, you have to try to make your spouse happy and to let go of your frustrations, to have mercy and compassion. And in this way, in the microcosm of the Rahma and Rahim between the spouses, we come to know the signs of our Lord, who is the most merciful and the most compassionate. So it's a very beautiful thing. And if you are creating a bond with people and then not creating a duration along, it doesn't have to be for your whole life. There's modularity in the Quranic rules about marriage, but there's room to fall back and have a divorce and ideally do it amicably. And this is strongly encouraged that it would be amicable as well, and so on and so forth. So there's these flexibilities, but the telos is certainly to achieve a fana through the marriage and through the contemplation of the nature of Allah in the theophany of becoming a good spouse. And that's a really beautiful thing. So if you're in zina, it can be, you go in the other direction, you become abused of that connectivity with the others, presumably multiple partners. And then it's not simply because, polygamy is halal under context. So there's a trade-off. This trade-off is observed as being part of the fitra.
um, but it's meant to benefit the, for one thing, a population of women who wouldn't have access to a decent husband in emergency circumstances, or perhaps in a cultural decadence where there's a huge demographic displacement of marriable women who simply don't have eligible spouses, but also for the children. So there's a logic there, and the trade-off is acknowledged. It's not just a command entitlement for men. This is another part of the misunderstanding. The prohibition on hammer, maizur, intoxicants, and gambling. It's in the same verse as the prohibition on divination and ritual sacrifice on altars. So this is very interesting. Why are these all in the same verse, and do these have something to do with each other? So we know that intoxicants and gambling go amazingly well together. That's why casinos are serving free drinks. It's that they know you're going to lose more money on average if you're drinking and gambling longer, and being more inhibited, uninhibited in your betting size decisions and so forth. So they end up being very expensive drinks. And divination rituals and ritual sacrifices also go together. This is a big part of paganism in antiquity. Paganism is a misnomer term. I'm using it simply for alacrity, not to be precise, because the Christians will say Muslims are pagans, and vice versa, right? Muslims love to say Christians are pagans. And it's kind of like saying somebody is Gnostic. It's just a word that means a religious tradition that you don't like. But in the deep foreground of history, there were a lot of divination rituals as well as sacrifice, and they all went together. So then we can think about Hamar and sacrifice as a mental and spiritual counterpart of taking pleasure in blurring the clarity of our mental or spiritual observance. And we can think of gambling and divination as future seeking activities. So there's actually very interesting psychology in this one verse, and why there's this quadruplet of prohibitions in that pattern. They're two pairs, one mental and one spiritual, one dealing with intoxication or reverie of the present, and another dealing with anticipation of the future. So if you could do divination and then combine it with gambling, you might find yourself very successful trading stock options, for example. If you knew, if the tea leaves could tell you how exactly much the earnings miss or beat would be, then you could put that to work, and you could take $100 and buy one lot of calls, and um, turn it into $500 or $600, and then the next week there's another stock doing their earnings, and you have your tea, and you go, okay, it's going to be beat by a certain amount, and you buy those calls, and yeah, and so on. You could compound that $100 over the one earning season into probably a or maybe $300,000 over 10 or 11 trades. What a combination! Um, and in the history of religion, very often religious rites would combine intoxication with sacrifices. So we're going in a different direction now in this monotheistic covenant. So there's a good reason for all of that. Also, addiction to intoxicants is the root word for addiction has to do with religious devotion. So the substance that you're addicted to becomes an idol that you share devotion or service to, along with God, even if you are trying to serve God, because you're working so that you can drink, or you're working so that you can smoke, or you're working so that you can snort cocaine, for example. So it's important to free yourself from that idolatry, rather than, well, why not just dabble in it occasionally? Or what about the edge case of psychedelics, right? So psychedelics are not habit forming, and they can be utilized in a set and setting which is relatively safe. The problem there actually converges more on the divination and sacrificing on idols thing, where you're going to be opened up spiritually to jinn that will show you things that you'll think are very cool. And then you might spend the next 20 years of your life as a non dualist libertine because you came to conclusions about reality that were very jinn friendly and that take you outside of Islam or outside of monotheism at large. Um, but theoretically, sometimes you can also have experiences in psychedelics that do the opposite for you, and this has also been reported. So there's an element of divination and gambling in that particular form of Hammer, which is kind of interesting. Um, and this is why I would say that if they're not haram, they're makruh, and that the way to make it not haram and simply makruh is to go into it with a certain intent and with the guidance of a sheikh, not a tribal shaman, but somebody who is going to try and give you the reinforcement so that your vision quest comes out in a monotheistic direction, inshallah. If you're going to do it at all, and there's plenty of precautionary principle to say just don't do it. Um, then we have the prohibitions on economy that we get from the Hadith. So in the Quran it says, "Do not consume each other's wealth unlawfully except for trade by mutual consent." So you might say, well, if I'm purchasing a meme coin like Joe Bowden coin in about 4 months ago, you could have bought a couple $100 worth of this joke coin based on a funny misspelling of a U.S. president's name, and it could have gone to 20 or $40,000, and it went from like a 1 million market cap to 200 million, and then guess where it is now? It's all the way back down, right? So there were people who bought that at 50 cents or a dollar or even 10 cents, and they're just way down on their investment because it's utterly valueless and kind of silly. And so is this haram or halal? Well, it's being done via mutual consent. And then there are hadiths where, which I think probably have historical reality to them, and they come in a number of variations as hadiths are wont to do, where um, various odd transactions are prohibited by the Prophet Muhammad in Medina, such as selling somebody clothes that they can't see it. They reach into a bag and kind of feel the texture of the clothes and go, sure. And so they've already agreed to pay a fixed price. So these sort of carnival game styles of transactions were banned. Everything has to be done transparently. And then furthermore, there's a prohibition on harar, which means, wow, what does it mean? Different madhabs have different interpretations. The Hanbalis actually get this one right, funnily enough. So I'm always saying how the Hanbalis are the worst, yet there are a number of points where they are actually smarter about things, because this is part of the exercise of freeing ourselves from these dialectical antagonisms. And this is another one. So the Hanafis and others will say it just means uncertainty, and they create a broad prohibition on all sorts of transactions involving risk, which is kind of silly. Whereas the lack of delivery interpretation is more correct. So if I'm a farmer in America in the 1800s and I sell a forward contract on my grain to Archer Daniels Midland, who is taking that and putting it into factories and manufacturing packets of crisps and so on, in a primitive, prototypical form of industrial food. The credit risk of Archer Daniels Midland is pretty good. But if I'm just taking this contract with some guy from the town, maybe his balance sheet is unstable, and maybe he gets in a position where he can't afford to pay me the money that we agreed come the harvest time. So that's a form of garar. Um, and that therefore, there's going to be a failure to deliver, and the contract will then go into arbitration. There will be a dispute, it has to go to a judge. So this sort of thing was prohibited in order to clear the air and limit the amount of stress that the but also they didn't have a sophisticated system. They would have had to go right back to the Prophet alayhi salam in order to dispute these things, as the famous pro hadith people like to quote that verse that you have to submit to the Prophet in disputes. Well, that certainly had a contextual reality to it in that time. And they'll say it means that every hadith that ever was collected and deemed authentic by their guys, is binding on everybody who submits to the Quran. That's another story, but it's certainly like with the military commands, which the Quran talks about. Don't run away from battle. It'll be worse than if you went into battle. The same applies to these governance issues within Medina. So then this gets extrapolated, and we have a bizarre situation in Islamic finance where the Gulf countries are all on riba. They're all using US dollar pegged currencies, and they have credit cards and things. But the Islamic banks will not do futures contracts. So that same farmer that I'm drawing analogy on in the 20th century has a regulated futures exchange where they can sell their grain, and it's got mountains of backstops. So it doesn't really have Garar. And if you appreciate the why of that prohibition, instead of taking it as a power decree on face value, then you can appreciate this distinction. Um, so the same applies to the rest of the covenants. Obviously, abusing inheritances, which hadiths abrogating the Quran lead to, unfortunately, it's a big problem. People being disinherited in the Middle East because they're following the wrong, they're following baseless hadith instead of the Quran. So everybody should get a fair shake on the inheritance, right? There's a why to that. There's a why to how divorce works. Divorce is underspecified in the Quran, so this gets abused. But if you look at the more stringent prohibitions on divorce in the Injil, and then you moderate it with verses in the Quran, you can see that Surah Talaq is not giving men a blanket right to talaq women. It prohibits talaqing a woman by comparing her to her mother. She's not her mother. Her mother's a whole other person, right? This is a funny verse. But people assume because it's named Surah Talaq, and that's not a part of the Quran itself, that's a post hoc editing, that men have a blanket right to just divorce a woman. It's like at will employment. Um, but there's a why to all of these things. Divorce is meant to be a last resort in a context. Um, let's see what else. What other harams and halals are troubling to people? Oh, the marriage rules about marrying non-Muslims. This is one that comes up a lot. So now we're getting into more trepidatious territory, or perhaps about homosexuality. So with homosexuals, it says, we created these spouses for you, and it's ungrateful for you to go lust after men. But the thing is, God did create people homosexual, and this is something that people have difficulty with reconciling. And this is something that the culture had not come to terms with until recently. So there's the infamous TikTok that was circulating on Ramadan 2023, where a homosexual male couple has two children they've adopted, and the guy is reading Quran and keeping up with his salah and exercising and cooking, and he's living a pretty, seems like a good lifestyle that's wholesome. And then he has this very light pack with his husband, and they've got these two kids that they've adopted. So there's a hadith that says that if you sponsor two orphans to puberty, so presumably they'll go further, they'll help these kids through age 18 through age 21 and so on, then you're guaranteed Jannat al Firdaus, the highest level of paradise. Now, if we presume that homosexuality is a sin, which is pretty reasonable to take from the Quran, then we might assume that these guys are fasiks, they're openly sinning, and yet they're also openly doing virtue. So it becomes this strange, extreme edge case where maybe they'll be in Iraq for a while and they don't have to go to hell because they've got so many good deeds to their credit. I think that's, or maybe better than that, even if we average a bunch of sins that might get you in like level 2 or level 4 of punishment, and then things that would get you on level 5, 6, or 7 of paradise, maybe they average out higher than Al Araf. And that seems to be their logic. So obviously, the why there is that it's not conducive to social order to have, homosexuality, and yet in modernity, there seems to be this pocket of activity where people are, they're adopting these kids and they're not reproducing otherwise, right? So Allahu Alam with that one. And there are, it's like with the psychedelics. This becomes one of these edge cases where it's not a clear answer. It seems like it's bad, but maybe there's an edge case. And so for people who are in this conundrum, I don't necessarily recommend it. The alternative is a life of celibacy and becoming extremely devotional aesthetes, as many in the traditions have done. So, such as, for example, Rumi was said to have had these kinds of inclinations, and he devoted himself to a mystical, passionate expression and became a titan of the tradition. So, there's another approach. It's not really my particular problem, but I can see how this is troubling for a lot of people. And then the other one is women who want to marry non-Muslim men. So it doesn't explicitly say in the Quran not to do it. This is a fiqh inference, and it's based on a reasoning that women are weak, and therefore they're impressionable to their husband's religion. But I think when we see women who are devout Muslimah and they get married to Christian men, for example, that they don't become Trinitarians. And this is an aspect of modernity. So if you think about the why there, I'm not giving fatwa that this is acceptable or not acceptable, but you can see where they're coming from in that kind of logic. So a lot of these things that we encounter in so-called progressive Islam, where people are defying fiqh rulings or even abrogating, rejecting some hadiths and saying, well, based on a looser interpretation of the Quran, I can justify this as maybe acceptable. Maybe they're wrong. It's the same thing with, our Quran is praying the right way and so on, but that there's a why underlying all of these things. Another one would be the hijab. So the command is not wear a head covering. The command is that draw the head coverings that you already have over your adornments so that there's modesty, right? So wearing a sweater might accomplish this as well. And young women have been martyred in Iran over that, and that's not nice. So is this worth so much strife? Right now, we've got a new president in Iran, mashallah, who's petitioning the Ayatollah to loosen up about that. And there are quite a lot of women who, in the West, who are Muslimah and they're very devout, but they don't wear hijab because they don't think it's a commandment. They think it's a contextual thing. And so they're also applying the whiness. So, you could argue that thinking about things based on why, like a stubborn child says, why should I do that? And then you say, because XYZ, and they go, oh, like, okay, that seems reasonable. And then they comply, but only with justification that this is problematic because it can lead one into fisk or even kufr if you have a very expansive concept of kufr. So, like earlier, when I was saying that the Sunni ulema are upon kufr when they try to denigrate the apparent meaning of certain verses and insist that one must believe such denigration. I'm not trying to say that they're necessarily kufar, or that they're kafirin. That would be a sort of habitual kufr, but it is a covering of the truth. And there's always a risk when we interpret things more loosely that we are covering the truth in order to follow our hawa and our shawa, our religious desires and our lustful desires. So it's important always to pray for guidance and to be humble about these things. But and I've late at towards the end here, I've covered some very pernicious edge cases where there's a great amount of controversy, and it is one of those things, several of those things, in fact. But I think that largely speaking, if you think of Allah as reasonable and indeed the fount of all reason, that it comes to a deeper appreciation of the moral rectitude behind the Sharia covenant. And with this, instead of feeling like we're in a constant dialectic between the forbidden fruit of our desires and repression, we can be assertive about our embrace of the law. So if I drive through the city and I see bars and fast food restaurants, I know that most of these things that are on sale are haram for me. And I feel good about that because I like eating healthy foods and I like not drinking alcohol. But also, I'm older than a lot of people, statistically speaking. And I've, before I was a Muslim, I ate unhealthy foods and so on. And I, none of it is interesting to me. There's no mystery in these things, there's no forbidden fruit appeal. And with this comes wisdom. Now, it's also possible for somebody who's been raised Muslim their whole life, they've never tasted bacon, they've never tasted beer, even like a really good beer, to appreciate this without having the experience. The empirical approach is not a requirement, it's just one path. And this is where forgiveness comes in because there's value in people coming back to Allah or discovering Islam or any form of monotheism to get the ball rolling. And this is a part of the beauty of Allah's mercy and forgiveness. Um, but one can also reasonably arrive at this kind of wisdom. And inshallah, we will carry out our covenants with a full appreciation of the why behind them.